Supervises Professor Tiwari and mentorship of Professor Mohan. And it's a privilege for me to welcome all our esteemed guests on the dais today. I would first like to welcome our chair for the evening, Mr. Ram Manohar Reddy, who is the editor of the India Forum. And he's been working with the media since 1988 with the newspapers Deccan Herald, Bangalore.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session on public transport. I will keep my initial comments very brief. I just want to say that, of course, I'm honored to be here at this symposium in memory of Dinesh Mohan. I can't say that I knew him very well. My interactions were when I was at EPW, and then he used to write a number of articles on transport, public transport, and it was my privilege to publish what I think still stands as one of the outstanding articles, 2008, when he studied in detail metros in India. Anyway, you know, the past couple of days, we've had sessions on sustainable cities, urban planning, earlier before lunch on active mobility. In some sense, that they're now appropriate that we discuss public transport. There's something was great research interest to him, advocacy, and also involved in policy, as in the BRT. I just want to start by something that Ranjit Gadkil said earlier, that transport planning, there is no urban planning in India. At least it's all, the planning consists of building yourselves out of congestion. Okay? This is the environment in which we are talking about transport planning, public transport. But the challenge is huge, but I'm sure Dinesh was with us. He wouldn't have been defeated by this. We need to keep discussing, need to keep pressuring, and need to thinking of how to change policy. Let me start by, I just want to add one thing. We are on a very, very hard time constraint. We started late, but more than that, we have to vacate the hall by 4:30, 4:45, and there's a session after us. So we must wind up by 3:30, so I would request speakers to speak for about 10, 12 minutes. And please allow me to give you a warning 2 minutes before the end.
Thank you so much, sir. So for the panel, we request our first speaker for the evening, Mr. P.S.Kharola. Mr. Kharola is currently the chairman of the National Recruitment Agency, and he's a 1985 batch Karnataka IAS.
Good afternoon to the chair and all my friends, panelists, and the distinguished audience. We have been asked to deliberate upon the public transport system. Well, we have not highlighted any issues on which to deliberate upon and all. So I thought that I can just frame some issues and throw them up for discussions. I think the moderator did mention one thing, that all our planning is basically, especially in the field of transport, becoming knee-jerk reaction. And we talk of bus transport, we talk of pedestrianization, we talk of dedicated lanes for bicycles, we talk of metro systems and all, but each one of them in complete isolation with the other. We still do not talk of a composite or a holistic or an integrated public transport system for a city. When we look at the big good examples, London and all those things, TfL, Transport for London and all, they are very good examples where they deal with public transport. And when you look in India, well, any city you take, there will be at least 8 to 10 different agencies involved in dealing with different legs of public transport. Well, I've had experience in working with most of them. Well, I had run buses, In BDA, we did urban transport planning. Then I also had the fortune of building the Bangalore Metro. Buses and metro are good competitors. So when we were running buses, we were just talking of buses. Then after 5 years, I'm put in metro, and we are just talking metro. So when I was in buses, the best public transport system was buses. And when we come to metro, the best public transport system is metro. So still, we still are, dealing with public transport in silos. And so that is the first issue I'd like to flag where all the panelists can react. Second is, yes, the oldest, the most versatile, and I would say that the most flexible system of public transport is the buses. And but why has it failed? We look all over the country. You take any city, the bus transport system has not risen to expected levels. What are the reasons? There may be several reasons. People say the cities are congested. Some people say government is not giving us enough money to run the buses. All those reasons are there. But my always hypothesis has been the bus transport system themselves are also accountable to a large extent for their failure. They just have never bothered about internal efficiencies. Everything is given. We run the buses, the fare is fixed by the government. If you don't earn money, nothing. The gap will be funded by the government. Now, it is this approach which has led to the bus-based public transport systems being highly inefficient. And when inefficiency grows, everyone abandons you. You look at the reputation or the image the bus transport system enjoys in any government. They just feel that the bus transport system is, they have come to take subsidy from us, to pay their salaries and all those things. So that's the second thing, why bus system has failed. Third is, what are the emerging challenges? Now, if we see, massive investment is being done on the metro system. And I would sure that more than 25 cities in the country would have metro systems. And even the biggest metro systems are not viable today. So the government does not mind putting money into metro systems, but when it comes to buses, there are questions asked. But the reasons are different. First of all, metro systems are highly capital intensive. And people think that if you spend money on capital, you end up in development. Bus transport systems are not capital intensive. So here the thinking is that if you spend on buses, you are giving subsidies. So it is this different approaches, different perception, which makes life difficult for the bus system. So the emerging challenge is, how does the bus system survive along with these metro systems? Have the buses reoriented themselves toward the metro system? In most of the places, there is absolutely no coordination between the metro system and the bus system. There can be different levels of integration between the buses and the metro systems. Now, the easiest one would be structural. Is the bus and the metro system under a common organization? Answer is no. Second could be route rationalization. Are the routes of buses and the metro systems so designed so as to supplement each other? The answer is again no. Both are running parallel, same routes, just eating away each other's passengers. Third, fare integration. It's totally missing. Just look at the fares of the buses and look at the fares of the metro systems. The metro fares are far higher, but still we do not think of having a common fare from one point to another. Let's not forget, we are all dealing with not bus or metro and all, we are dealing with urban mobility, and which is this which has to given the prime importance. Next challenge is going to be the rising cost of operations. Now, this is one point where the bus systems are beaten badly by the metro systems. The operating costs of metro systems, the cost of power with passage of time in real terms is coming down and will further come down. What about the fuel of buses? the price of the fuel is going up and would further go up, thus compounding the problems of viability of the bus systems. How do we resolve this issue? Next challenge is going to be the new technology. Now, why do we still think of buses running on petrol or diesel? We do have electrical buses, but once again, can we think of buses running on dedicated routes? Dedicated routes, or maybe trolley buses or electrical buses running on dedicated routes which are electrified? We have never applied our minds to that. Have you ever thought there is something called a capacitor-driven bus, which can in future solve the problem of batteries also? So these are the new technologies which are emerging, which the bus system will have to factor in. Last point. The private sector is conspicuous by its absence in public transport system. Why is it so? We talk of private sector, look at airports. Don't go far away, look at Delhi and Bombay airports. They were privatized, and see the outcome. Look at the telecom sector. It was privatized, we know the outcome. Buses, attempts have been made, I would say knee-jerk reactions have been made to bring in privatization into buses. Now, when we say privatization, it does not mean that lock, stock, and barrel, we just privatize the system. See, why do we privatize? We privatize for two main reasons. Number one is capital investment, which the private sector can do. And the more important is the managerial efficiency, which the private sector brings in. We have never tried these models. We have tried, I mean, cities have tried, but then they have all given up. So why the public transport system, especially the buses, have become so averse to privatization? So in my view, these are the 4 or 5 issues we can all deliberate upon, and I'll be very happy to give my comments on what are the issues emerge, and I would really love that this becomes a more deliberative and a discussion session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. I invite our next speaker, Mr. Partho Mukhopadhyay, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research.
Thank you so much. So first, let me begin by thanking the organizers for asking me to be here. This is especially memorable occasion in some sense. Partly because Professor Mohan was quite a figure, though we interacted not too frequently, but my memories of him are of a quality which I think is essential in some sense for all academia, of that of complete irreverence. And you sort of, what I really enjoyed about him is the fact that nothing was a sacred cow, and all sort of statements were up for debate, and which is what made every conversation with him something that was both scintillating as well as enlightening. So it's one of those fireworks which not only sort of have sparks but also have lights in the sky, and that's a memory that I think I would really sort of have of Professor Mohan, and so I'm grateful that both Peggy and Rakesh are here. The second is the one big learning I've taken away from him is that the importance of the two-wheeler. And I think it has shaped my thinking and my work in the way I look at both cities. I look at, I use it often as a metric in the way we look at how changes in urbanization are taking place. And it's central in some sense of thinking on public transport. So that's how, and you will see it in this presentation as we move along. So the question that I'm asking myself in some sense is, can we envision an India where all public transport, maybe not the metro, we should figure out later, is free, right? And what would it take to make that happen? So obviously, what is fare free public transport? Somebody has to pay for it. It is free at the point of use. which means that you can jump onto any, let's think of a world with buses. I'll come to the metros later. You can basically jump onto any bus going in any direction and not worry about paying a fare. Which means, and we already have some of this. I mean, in Delhi itself has free travel for women. You've had free travel off-peak times, peak times for senior citizens, for a variety of people. So there is some structures we can get through in that particular area. But that's, the theme is there. What we're looking for is what happens if we take it to the extreme, which means everybody all the time essentially doesn't have to pay a fare for using it, the transport in some sense, right? But obviously somebody has to pick up the tab, and I'll come to how that structure is. In some places it is local governments which pick it up. You could have a tourist town, a lot of fees coming in, let's say from cesses that you charge on hotel rooms, and that gives you the ability to provide free public transport in that particular city to go around the city. There could be general taxation stuff from other levels of government, and in principle, this is something that we'll address from users of individual transport, right? But we also must recognize, and as Mr. Kharola just pointed out in the case of the metro, that there is definitely a fetish about capital investment. And what this would do was essentially sort of shift the bias towards making more capital investment, because if you're not looking to sort of recover things on a per-use basis. So this is a risk that we need to keep in mind as we sort of go forward in that area. The second is the pace at which you make investments, especially if we're looking at buses, and this is, again, as Mr. Kharola mentioned, an area where lots of technologies are coming in, obsolescence risk is high, but at the same time we must realize that buses have relatively short lives. You're looking at 5 to 7 years at the outside, and therefore the obsolescence risk is not that high. The lock-ins are really not that high when you're thinking about that particular space. Right? So now what do we know about it so far? I'll be very quick about this. Broadly speaking, there are varieties of about recent work. If you're looking at roughly about 250 odd places where we had some sense of a fare-free public transport of different kinds. I've already mentioned the Delhi example. We have had some Chinese cities which have moved forward with it, but largely still very much a function of the West. And there isn't really a clean consensus that it's a good thing, of course, right? So there are, on the left, as you can see, and trust me, the left and the right, and the good and the bad have nothing to do with political implications. What you see is one of justice, a little less on climate benefits, much less than I would have thought when I looked at the literature a priori. And that's largely because historically, or rather so far what we have seen in the West is relatively little modal shift as a result of something like this. And I'll come back to that issue down the line. And the other issue is, the risk that, if you allow this to happen, the people will just go away, efficiencies will drop, all you have is a bunch of decaying buses which never leave the depot. So you don't have service, but you have investment, right? There's also the fact that it's unnecessary because, as I said, there is, even if you put in free public transport, nobody else is shifting. In fact, there might be some people who are walking and therefore have moved to buses, and that might have some adverse effects in some sense, right? So that's the current state of the art, and I'll go back to that particular story. There's also this whole link between mobility as a service and fare-free public transport. But if you think of mobility as a service, what it does is it sort of delinks private vehicle ownership from the use of the private vehicle. So you could still have a basically car-centric city with nobody owning cars. And therefore, in some senses, one could think of, and this is something that we could discuss, the MAS as something as a complement to the fare-free public transport kind of story, right? So in this context, how is India different, right? So the first thing is we have, largely because as we have hardly invested in public transport. In 2008, when I think the Ministry of Urban Development did its first sort of, I think it's one of the, somebody else who sort of did the first survey of these songs. I remember that out of the 60 cities that they looked at, about 21 or 22 of them actually had bus services. This was just before the JNNURM scheme came up with the GFC and the schemes for JNNURM buses were started. And of those 22 odd cities, 20 of them were state capitals. So if you had a state, so there was a great sort of correlation between if you were a state capital, you would have a bus service. If you are not a state capital, regardless of the size of the city, where the chances you had a bus service are pretty small, right? But that gives us an opportunity today, right? And that opportunity is, we know that there is demand for public transport. And in fact, the private sector is very active in public transport. In fact, the only public transport that is actually provided in the country is by the private sector. And that is crowded stuff. It's poor quality, heavily used, relatively low cost, right? And comes with a variety of issues on the safety side and the structures and so on and so forth. So that's one part of the story. You know, have a demand for that particular story. Second is our urban structures are relatively compact and dense. There's a presentation here, and I can go back to it yesterday, which I think Mark Stevenson was making with a paper by Thompson et al. On essentially urban structures and what it meant for transport, grouping city types across the world in about 9 types. I think India was mostly in what they call informal, but basically it's compact and dense, and whatever growth takes place, it takes place along transport corridors, along road corridor structures, and there's still very limited car ownership, and I'll sort of come back to that in a second, but relatively growing high two-wheeler ownership. Right? And you have informal labor markets, which means that your peak and trough are relatively flatter as compared to a formal labor market. But there is also the other risk that you might shift. There's a lot of NMT that happens right now, and you might shift from NMT to MT. Good or bad, there's a climate story there, there's an individual welfare story there. You know, we'll have to balance those kinds of things out going forward. Right? But in a sense, I would argue that India is in a sweet spot in the public transport story, and therefore, unlike what you find about the lack of modal shifts in the West, what you are perhaps able to do is preempt the move to individual car transport here. And that's the kind of structure that we are moving through. A good quick example, and I'm happy to come back to this later, is Kolkata, which I'm surprised that no other city has actually replicated this wonderful model in terms of using of auto rickshaws on a route-based story. But it's an extremely clean, efficient, frequent mode of transport, used widely across income classes, and essentially walkable for almost, that number 70% may actually be close to 90%. I forgot, I have to look up the reference again. And I'm happy to sort of look forward to this, talk more about this as we go forward. Right now I'm keeping Ram's sort of thing in mind and come back to the crux of that particular story, right? So let's now ask the fundamental question, is this financially feasible? And I would argue it is. What I've done is, over here is literally back of the envelope. And what the net bottom line of this is that if you charge 10,000 rupees a year to every car in India, and 500 rupees a year to every two-wheeler in India, you'd have enough money to provide bus services to every urban resident of India at the level that transport planners say is necessary. The question is, why aren't we doing it? Right? To address, so the first thing is 10,000 rupees a year a big number for a car user? A very, would it be as much of a pushback as Sheila Dikshit's voters did when the Delhi BRT was introduced? I don't think so. Would 500 rupees per two-wheeler, and I've just put that in for equity reasons, be a massive pushback? Possibly not, right? So what we are looking at, therefore, is now then how do we address the other issue that Mr. Kharola spoke about, which is the tendency to move into inefficient modes of operations? And that, I think, Delhi has a reasonable answer to some of it. We actually now have, the way I've calculated the costs on this is from the recent gross cost contracts that have been bid out for electric buses in India. So this is actually a financially feasible model for flooding India with electric buses. We currently have, I think the production is about 7,000 or 10,000 buses a year is the capacity. We're looking at 200,000 buses a year. So it will take a long time to sort of phase these kinds of things in. But the story is the gross cost contracts that have been bid out, and this is like total costs, are under 50 rupees. This is on a bunch of about 50 rupees per kilometer, but depending on both the number and the scale, one of the things is actually 39 rupees. But the second is, there's obviously going to be a difference in the amount of money raised, let's say in Delhi, and the number of buses that is needed in, let's say, Kolkata. And how do you make those kinds of transfers? These kinds of issues will arise. There are lots of details to be hammered out. I'm just giving, which is why I said it's a back of the broad feasibility kind of question, to just say that this is not fairy sort of dreaming kind of story on a financial basis. And we can talk about what is stopping these kinds of structures in place. And obviously, if you've got 80,000 crores a year, the chances that it'll all go to build something around the right of 2,000 kilometers of metro is a distinct possibility, right? Given the fact that it's not going to come through. This is the right time for doing this. What you see from these four graphs, and this is from the top row is from the NSS 72nd round, which looked at use of services, and the second is from the NSS 69th round, the last round, is a long time ago. Both of them are a long time ago, given the fact that we have stopped surveys in this country. And what you see is, one of the big things I'm sort of asking you to look at there is, in the top left-hand corner is the houses using only public transport. And the dotted line and the other black line are essentially both very large cities, except that the dotted line essentially has relatively good transport infrastructure, I mean bus services, and the solid black line doesn't. And you see that huge difference between two cities of roughly similar populations in terms of MPCs and incomes, in terms of the use of public transport. And that's largely a supply constraint. That is not a demand story. And that's one of the things I'd like to point out. The second is, obviously, if you look at the bottom structures, looking at the people using a bus and a tram, and that sort of almost flattens out, whereas the ones which are using spending on petrol and diesel, which means they're actually using some form of private transport, sort of moves up very rapidly. And that is the core issue that we need to worry about. But most of that is also issues of two-wheelers. And it is not clear to me always that the two-wheeler is, and this sort of shows the same thing by the sizes of towns and things of that sort. So I'd be happy to, this is from the census.
Partho, can I request you a couple of minutes?
I'm done. I'm about, I think this is the last slide. So the core issue here is, in terms of doing it, this is the time when we haven't yet moved into four-wheeler ownership. Our two-wheeler ownership is exploding. So if you want to forestall that next move into four-wheeler ownership, this is the time to intervene. So the first issue. The second is automobiles have the internal combustion engine historically been a major job provider. But that world is now changing. The electric vehicles now come with many fewer parts and therefore many fewer suppliers. And the job generation coefficient of electric vehicles is at a very different level than that of automobiles. And therefore the shift from less automobile production and into structures is not necessarily as much of a job destroyer as it would have been if the technology hadn't shifted. Right? The climate benefits aside, the second is we're unlikely to, I mean, Darshini is here, the whole idea of a 15-minute city is unlikely to be realized in our lifetimes. But we may be able to at least provide a 45-minute commute to most places in the city if we moved into this kind of service, and that will essentially make our cities a much more inclusive place to be in. And finally, you do have mass, which for people who would like individual transport, but at the same time are not structured in place, is something that we could think of as a complement in that particular structures. The shift, the other benefit in India would be that the shift to this kind of fare-free public transport centered around buses would largely be, I would suggest, move to on predicating electric buses, but not necessarily dependent on it, because even if you buy a non-electric bus today, it'll be over and done and dusted in 5 to 7 years' time, by which time you'll have some capacity for doing electric buses in that particular systems. So the obsolescence risk and structures in place, and compared to sort of shifting this large infrastructure of two-wheelers into non-electric modes, you're much more able to move a smaller infrastructure into electric mode and structures going forward. Also with the caveat that, remember, unless you have occupancy, it doesn't really make sense to move people from two-wheelers into buses or three-wheelers into buses in terms of a climate story, given how much fuel you have per person kilometer going forward. But if you do have capacity buses, it does make a lot of sense. So that's the structure that you can move through. So thank you, and hopefully this is something that we can talk about.
Thank you so much, sir. We definitely would have a lot to talk about in this presentation. Next, I invite our next panelist, Ms. Shri Mukund Sinha, who has served across a lot of strategic and operational assignments in India. He currently works with ADB.
Good afternoon to you all. It's indeed an honor to be speaking here on the Dinesh Mohan Memorial Symposium, and as it is an honor also to be a part of the very esteemed members of the panel. I would be very quickly going through some of the ideas, thoughts on EVs, and EVs have been touched upon in the presentation of Dr. Kharola as well as Dr. Partho, and there is a huge talk about EVs as there is an increase in sales we can see from the graph. But I would like to point out here on the right side of the graph where we see the components of these EVs which have been sold, and a huge and the larger share is that of two-wheelers. If we talk about the year-on-year growth, the growth in two-wheelers EVs is 60% CAGR for the last 6 years. Also, I would like to point out here that for the goods vehicle, it's a very small amount. It's 0.24% of the total sales. And also would like to point out that buses are a very small number in that. It doesn't even feature in terms of the percentage. It's very minuscule. Talking about e-buses, there is a very low penetration as we saw in the previous graph. There are 5 major sellers of bus. I would not say producers as such because most of the items currently are being imported. Most of the components have specifications and designs which are vendor driven, and I would come to that at a later stage. There is a high cost. Cost is mostly on account of batteries, but I would say the cost of the batteries are coming down. There was a scheme which was announced by the government about 2 years back as the Green Urban Mobility Scheme as a part of the cooperation between Government of Germany and Government of India, about 1 billion euros. And that has not been rolled out as of now. It's almost 2 years. And the reason, I guess, and I understand, is the high cost. The municipal bodies, the urban local bodies, the states are not willing to take electric buses on high cost, despite the fact that there are schemes of subsidies. That could be one reason. The other reason is the entire ecosystem which is required for the e-bus system. It's not just the bus. There is an investment which is required on the charging infrastructure, on the communication part, which could be, which could put up formidable issues in front of the operators, the owners of the buses. And characteristics of buses are very different from the vehicles which are being produced at large quantities now comparatively. If we compare with two-wheelers, three-wheelers, the bus technology is different, the requirements are different. The requirements are different for urban buses, for intercity buses, for long-distance buses. Within the urban setup itself, there are requirements different from different cities. There are states which have gone for electric buses. West Bengal, Maharashtra, and some states have gone for electric buses. But the challenges are yet to be seen because these are new buses with new systems set up by the vendors themselves. And it is only a question of time when we would see that there would be issues in terms of replacement, in terms of finding a different, a competitive market to replace that. So here I just wanted to touch that, talking in terms of the bus quantum, how much is buses required, we see that India is almost third in terms of number of buses. If we talk about buses per million, then it would be, on the right side. But talking about quantum of buses from the point of view of seeing what is the ecosystem of when we try to shift to e-buses, then what is the requirement? There is a huge requirement of public buses in India, even at the current benchmark. And as we know, the current benchmark is very below than what is the ideal benchmark. So there is a forecast in terms of e-buses fleet. And why I am pointing out to this particular slide is that we see that China is already there in e-buses. It has the largest share, not only in e-vehicles, but also in e-buses. And if we go down the graph and we see the projections, then we see that India would be matching almost Europe. And here, Europe is, again, I would like to mention here that the proliferation of e-buses in Europe, again, it's very vendor-driven, very specific to European conditions. And most of the research which has happened in e-buses is, again, very vendor-driven. It's very less from the government side in terms of research and technology. And why I'm mentioning this here is that India would have to either depend on foreign vendors, and which would not be very right thing to do because the conditions within India are different. So though there are issues which we can imbibe directly from the other countries, there are certain issues which are specific to India, and I would come to that now. Higher ambient temperatures, monsoon weather, driving trips are shorter, roads are rougher. There is a higher penetration of smaller vehicles, two-wheelers, three-wheelers. Small goods transport has been prevalent in many cities. And as I mentioned, potentially large population of buses. Some challenges which we see in the other countries, and I would say here it's basically China, European countries, and the US. The charging infrastructure availability is a challenge. Chip shortages, we have seen this in the recent times. And as the demand for EVs go up, this could be a major challenge in the coming years also. Battery shortages, reliance of rare earth materials. This is something which is questionable because there's a big debate going between the proponents and the critiques of EVs. And synchronizing market and industry. Here, what I mean is that since the research is having in the developed countries, is going on in the developed countries, and requirement, we are talking about requirement in developing countries, there is a mismatch between what the market demands, what is actually required, and what is actually available. So we see that if we, in another 7-8 years, the total demand would be something like 271 billion kilowatt hours. This is something which we need to keep in mind because there could be a huge gap between the supply and the demand in terms of energy demand. And also, the EV to public charger ratio. How many charging systems are required? What is the charging infrastructure which is required if we are looking at the trajectory which I showed in the previous slides? That is something that demand will have to be met. These are challenges which are still there in China. Very few literature would be available on that, but some of the presentations and interactions which I have had within my current organization, it points out that there are issues in terms of charging requirements, even with a very good charging infrastructure. This has come recently in the news, about just 3 days back. California urges residents again not to charge EVs on busy travel weekends. So, as I mentioned, the demand of energy, also the changes in the demand with higher temperatures. That's something which could be crippling for even a very good system like we have in California. They are quite that way aware of climate issues and emission issues, and they have been able to set up a very good EV structure, EV system there. Talking about temperature, how it plays havoc on battery performance, why I have this slide here is that the ambient temperatures in India are much different to those places where the basic research on EV has happened, and based on which specifications we are getting our EVs now. High heat initiates chemical reactions, and it can actually reduce the battery life. Also, battery capacity is reduced with reduced temperature. Though the capacity increases with higher temperature, the life is reduced. The self-discharge rate increases as the temperature increases. So we might say that the requirement is, say, 150 kilometers, but that depends on a particular temperature. And when we see a huge fluctuation in temperatures, this might change. Cold batteries severely slow down fast charging capabilities. There is a possibility that during extremes of winters, we'll find that the car is not charging with the current setup we have. And there is a change in the charging voltage itself with temperatures. So these are certain issues which are very specific to India and countries where there is a huge difference in terms of ambient temperatures and where the temperatures are high. Now, manufacturing challenges. If we are looking at a very huge proliferation of electric buses, then there are certain challenges. There are certain materials where which are rare and for which we'll have to be dependent on other countries. For example, lithium, we have to depend on few countries if the requirement goes up. Cobalt, it's available mostly in one, it's a monopoly of one particular country. And talking about permanent magnets, though permanent magnets are used in only some of the motors in EVs, mostly it's induction motors, but in permanent magnets there are certain rare materials required, which is now the monopoly only of China. So we need to have these things in mind. There's a multiplicity of charging and battery specs. So if we want a very fast charging, it has to be a DC charging. DC charging has its own different infrastructure. If we look for an AC charging where the charging setup is easier to put up, the charging is slow. So the requirements for personal vehicles, for cars, for larger vehicles like buses are very different. So there is a multiplicity of requirements in terms of specifications and technology. So whether we will be able to match with those requirements as we go up, or we will be able to innovate and have something one which fits all. This is something which we need to ponder upon. So this is a bit dated, about 1 year back, but it talks about the various, this is Indian standards, various charging types which we need for the various types of vehicles, for light vehicles, for e-buses, trucks, and for battery swapping. So there are different schools of thoughts here, whether we should go for battery swapping or we go for fast charging, on-board charging, off-board charging. But then we will need to also have an integrated approach in terms of developing the market for that. This is an extract from the IS specifications. So just to show that there are many specifications already, and many more might have been drafted in the last 1 year. So we have many specifications here. In terms of the sockets itself, you find that there is a large number of specifications. The issues which we had in a mobile charger some time back, that you buy a mobile, but you have to buy a particular charger for that mobile. So these issues need to be tackled. This needs some very basic indigenous research and technology development. So rare earth metals, as I mentioned, the proponents of EVs, they say that it's not an issue because everything is recyclable. Gold, silver, lithium, cobalt, these are all recyclable. The question is that, will we be able to recycle? So, talking about any sort of, I'll just, last slide, any efforts of recycling material, even in our domestic area or in the Swachh Bharat mission, have we been successful? So this is my last slide. I'll just leave you with this thought. I was just talking to a colleague of mine in KFW, and he said that Germany is probably thinking of starting the, coal-powered plants again because of this war, and they are not getting gases. The heating cost in Germany has gone up. It's almost doubled. Also, when we talk about EVs, we do seem to be talking about reducing pollution. But are we talking about reducing congestion? I think one of the major issues in public transport is reducing congestion. Are we talking about that? Or are we also looking at something which is going to cause more congestion? Because here you are going to have a lot of charging equipments around where you have low charging. So where do you park? Where do you have the charging equipments? Those matching things are required. You need a parking where you have a charging equipment. I'll stop here and will be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I invite our moderator, Mr. Sanjeev Sahai, who is an IAS and DG of Power Foundation.
Mr. Kharola actually made my job very easy when he listed out the issues concerning public transport system, but bus system in particular. He clearly raised the issue of the lack of composite planning, though there was MOUD had talked about unified urban transport planning bodies. Then he also mentioned why the bus systems are poorly managed and about their efficiencies. And in terms of lack of composite planning, he also talked about the lack of integration of fares and how capital-intensive projects find greater traction than meeting the operating expenses which the buses require and the subsidy. That easily transitioned into Partho's point. And Partho's point was free passes. And Partho actually gave both sides of the story, though finally he did conclude by saying that the way to get people back to the buses and also prevent or forestall the explosion of private cars in India would be to give a good quality bus system which is free. Mukund raised various issues which EV vehicles have, especially in India, the charging infrastructure, ambient temperature, the efficiency of batteries, the grid issues, and he pointed out to what California is facing, raw material, etc. All in all, it was a fascinating set of talks, and I would now request the chairperson.
Good afternoon. My question is for Mr. Kharola and probably for Mr. Sahai. One of the things that we talk about is performance measures and using performance measures to measure a transit agency's efficiency, a bus agency. Is it possible in the current government setup and everything else, where we do where the agency comes at the forefront at the start of the year and says, hey, this is the amount of money I need for the next year, and this is the ridership I will provide, and this is the key performance indicators I will provide, and give me the funding beforehand, and if I don't hit it, then there is some penalty or something like that. Is it possible to make that happen? Because what we see is exactly what you're saying. There is no incentive for any of these agencies to do better. And whenever we are doing technology also, they say it's extra work for me, rather than saying that, hey, it is part of my job. Okay. That's my question.
Yeah, I think What you have asked is that can performance be incentivized, and can these bus transport companies upfront ask for, well, we want this sort of support, and this is what we will deliver? Well, theoretically speaking, the answer is yes. It can be done. Now, let's see how it happens today. Now, today, how it happens is that they don't come upfront. The fares, that is the money which they earn, the rate, the fares are not in their hands. They just have to run buses. It is the government which fixes fares. And when this happens, they run the buses, they lose money. And maybe periodically, 3 months or 6 months back, after 6 months, they say that, yes, you fix the fares, and now this is what we have lost. Please give us money. Now this exactly is a cost plus system. Now, such a system does not bring in efficiencies. And even if you do it upfront, there is not a big difference. Now, something very close to this is we tried was automatic fares, which means link the fares to a couple of indices. And the most basic index in case of bus transport can be the fuel cost. It was said that straight away, you give the fares, and whenever the fare, the diesel cost increases by a certain amount, the fares should also correspondingly be adjusted by that amount. So a formula was done. It worked very well for maybe 6-7 months and all, and then what happens is, some elections come, and the moment some elections come, the state says, yeah, please hold on. So we are back to the old system where we are into a cost plus system. What you say theoretically is possible, but practically it has problems.
I think it's a very good question. But I would like to refer to the gross cost model, which I think Delhi experimented with, and it's been going on successfully. What does the gross cost model do? You bid out and you say the operator is impervious to the fare. And the person who provides a bus service, so they have to provide a particular kind of bus, and the service. Service means schedule, and cleanliness, and safety, etc. Then you are paid accordingly. So those efficiency parameters are built into the contract. Exactly what you're saying. So, No, that's not the point. No. You see, the moment you start focusing on ridership, then it ceases to be a service. And people will only try to then go to routes where you have ridership. This is a universal service obligation that buses do. Otherwise, who will go to a rural area or a semi-rural area? So that's part of urban planning. And bus route planning, you put the buses there. If the buses run on time, if the buses are of quality, they are safe, clean, people will come. Assuming all other exogenous factors are controlled in the sense that, rising incomes don't create problems, that congestion is not there. The fact of the matter is that there are a lot of exogenous variables. But what is within the control of the bus operator and the bus transport system, you lay it out upfront in a contract, and it's operating. It's operating beautifully in Delhi. Thank you.
First,
I'll just also quickly, one quick thing that you just said about ridership. What you're thinking, when you're looking at a gross cost model, you're essentially separating the transport planning function, which is essentially about generation of ridership, with the transport provision function, which is what the private operators do. Now, you usually think of them as being together, but they need not necessarily be. And so the transport planning function then goes through and then specifies these are the routes, these are the schedules, these are the stuff you put together, which is designed therefore to maximize ridership. There's also one other thing, if I can just request the chair, my co-author on the paper that I put together, Dr. Gaurav Mittal, is online in and in Singapore, so in case he wants to intervene, I'd like request him for a minute if he has that. Ram, all yours.
If he wants to, he will. Sure. Ranjit Gadgal, I think, had a question.
So one quick question for Mr. Kharola was that when you listed the advantages of private participation or private provisioning, as Partho is saying, of buses, the cost, and you said one of the advantages was capital investment. But I've also heard that the cost of capital for a private player may actually be much higher than the cost of capital for a public entity. And in fact, one of the stark differences between Metro and even DTC, if I'm not mistaken, is that the cost of capital for Metro is almost negligible with those low interest loans. And I've heard private players saying the cost of capital for them is market rate, so it's actually pretty high. So that was one quick comment. And I think what you probably didn't mention is that one of the issues with the private provisioning is lower labor costs. And I think that's where a lot of the contention also happens with people who are opposed to this, because they're essentially saying the savings are not coming from efficiency because they don't do any planning, they're just operating the bus. And really the efficiencies are not managerial, they're really the fact that they're paying a lot less than what a government agency has to do. So if you could just quickly comment on that. And if the other panelists could also comment on Partho's idea of free public transport, because it's a fascinating idea, it's been doing the rounds among civil society, and so it's great to see that being sort of laid out. But I think those who have managed large public transport corporations, if they could sort of reflect upon that would be pretty great. And the last comment is for Mr. Mukund Sinha. I'm always a little worried when we sort of call EV as being, that last cartoon has been doing the rounds, that is it really as clean? And I think there's a lot more detail to it than just saying, I mean, we all understand that electricity grids are not clean, but I still don't think that that's fully capturing the benefits of EVs. And especially if we're looking at EV buses, I think a lot of what you said may apply to if we are going crazy on the electrification of personal vehicles, because that doesn't solve our congestion and safety problems. But I think the electrification of buses perhaps then avoids a lot of those issues that you talked about. Perhaps, I don't know. Thanks.
I think a quick response. See, when I said the capital, I meant was private capital. Cost of capital, definitely. For private sector, the cost of capital will be higher, and for government sector, cost of capital is less. But then it's the availability of capital. Now, there are competing demands on the government capital, and that is why it always gets, second priority when you have to invest for buses. So it never comes. So we say that when private capital comes, so that was point. Yes, your point is well taken. That the cost of capital is more. That's the first point. The second, what you are saying is about the cost of operations. Now, cost of operation, you have a point when you say that the staff is paid much less by the private operator than by the government servant in the government sector. I'll just reverse it. I would say that in the government sector, in the public sector, the staff is overpaid. Now, this is not only for say, buses and all. I mean, I can give you example of airlines. You will be stunned to see or hear what an Air India pilot used to get. I mean, a package of a Air India pilot amounting to 2 crores a year will just make you go wild. So, anyway, the bus drivers and conductors are not that bad. But even then, the market forces, if you really see, they are really paid much, much higher. So apart from the payments, do they really do the work? So the entire system is such that, the entire system works to maximize the returns to the staff and not to deliver services. So these are my 2 short points.
Free public transport and Mukund for about electric.
Yes, Mukund first.
I think Reddy was asking others to respond to
Yeah, so
I'll let them.
I completely agree that if we go for buses and we go for EVs in general, it's something good. We should go for that, there's no doubt. Just in my presentation, I wanted to point out some of the issues which might be specific to India, and we should sort of try to tackle them now itself. Also a point that demand management, I mean, there has to be some sort of demand management in terms of two-wheelers, because the production, there's a lot of incentive for manufacturing of two-wheelers, a lot of incentive for the buyers to buy two-wheelers. very little incentive for the buses. As I mentioned, that for that particular scheme is waiting for more than 2 years now, and it's not yet been rolled out. It's just free money which has come to us, but we are not able to utilize that. I agree with you on that.
On free public transport.
Free public transport would, I got a sense it was only up to buses. And metro is something you had left out. So I'll confine it to buses. I don't think buses and cars are competing in terms of choice. People who use cars are not, at least in India, even they don't, I mean, I can't say that for everyone, but for those on the margin, but mostly I don't think. The competition is between two-wheelers users, potential people who will shift from buses to two-wheelers. Buses have been structured in a manner, the bus system, that it is meant for the not so well off. And I think it is a good idea to have free fares for people. I've seen anecdotally that for women, domestic labor, for women labor, it has given them access to work because of free bus service. So it makes a smaller, makes no dent, commute doesn't make a dent to their pockets. I have no idea once this is done, what will happen to urban spatial planning. Will it push the poor out from center on the argument that the buses are free and they can come from a greater distance? I don't know. It has a potential. I don't know whether that will happen. But free transportation will have its ramifications on urban planning. I'm certain about that. And that needs to be factored while making a case for this. Thank you.
This is Sharif from TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute. Just a couple of points. One point in terms of favoring free public transport, particularly buses, is that it's more of a philosophical kind of argument. The person who is sitting there in the bus, he is not contributing to the congestion. Why not, incentivize that person to remain in buses, rather than him, once he get the affordability, he switches to two-wheelers or four-wheelers. So that is one argument. The second is in terms of the quality of service of the bus particularly, is in terms of how sensitive the drivers and the conductors are towards the users. And this is my personal experience as well as, what I see around. So any thought on that?
Yeah. Could you spell that out a little bit more on the attitude of drivers to passengers?
Thanks. So basically, and I had discussions with people in the DIMS as well. The people running the orange cluster buses as well. So they are constrained in terms of how to sensitize drivers. Most of the times, the drivers are either using mobile phones while they are driving on busy Delhi roads. So that's one, and they have been constrained in terms of how to push these drivers to drive in a certain way and behave in a certain way. So that is something. Even today, while coming to this seminar, I saw an elderly woman, like in 50s, running behind a bus, and the bus didn't stop to pick her. And it didn't take off like a few hundred meters, but it was just there in 10 meters. It didn't stop to pick her up. So how do you sensitize that and bring into the public transport domain? Yeah.
Can we just with one last round, if you have anything to say, then we...
So I ran the cluster buses for some years. And there's a problem. There's a problem of shortage of trained bus drivers. And I don't think we have enough training schools, adequate, So these drivers are not taken off and paid to have paid training. So if they're out for 5 days, then the salaries are cut. And that was kept as something internal to the bus transportation company. Talking on the cell phone is not just a bus driver's problem. You know, people on two-wheelers and cars and DTC buses and all are doing it. This is a behavioral issue. People need to be trained. When you say sensitizing, you mean being trained or exemplary punishment to the driver, whoever does that. As far as not stopping on the bus stops, I'm surprised because there's an elaborate GPS system which have been put in the buses. The bus stands have been, geo-fenced. If it's not being done, then the problem is of the people who are managing the bus systems, and they must be asked why. So you should inform DIMS and the transport department. That would be the best way of doing things.
Yeah. Last very brief question. We have. Yeah. Sorry, Ravi. We have to close. Okay. Otherwise, your session gets eaten into. Yeah. Okay.
Sir, I request now Reddy sir to give the final closing remarks for this.
No closing remarks. We have to close the session. I just like to say one comment which was there in the brief and mentioned, I think, by Dr. Verghese in the previous session, in passing by Partho. We are now in a situation where in India, at least, running a two-wheeler is cheaper than a bus ticket, traveling by bus. So in that context, maybe something radical like what Partho is talking about is time to think about, or maybe raising the price of fuel, reducing the concessions to two-wheelers. Anyway, thank you. We have had a very interesting discussion, presentations. Each person has spoken about a specific area. There's a lot of things for us to think about, and there is actually a lot more as well in the realm of public transport that we need to think about, and it's something that actually we don't have in India. We only have the metros now in India, if you want to call it public transport, as it were. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.